So, imagine this. 185,000 soldiers mysteriously die in a single night, and no one even raised a sword against them. This event isn't just strange, it shakes everything we thought we knew about history, faith, and divine power. What really happened? And, more importantly, why did God allow it to happen? The answers to these questions are hidden in one of the Bible's most fascinating stories, and trust me, it's packed with lessons about justice, sovereignty, and trust. Stick around till the end and find out how this story unfolds. Back in the 8th century BC, the Middle East was a chaotic patchwork of wars, conquests, and shaky political alliances. In the middle of all that chaos, the Assyrian Empire stood out as the big bully on the block. Led by powerhouse kings like Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, and Sennacherib, Assyria was on a rampage, crushing nations, expanding its borders, and squeezing heavy tributes out of its enemy. Their army? Oh, it was infamous, brutal, massive, and efficient to the core. Around the same time, down in the little kingdom of Judah, King Hezekiah was doing his best to steer his people in a different direction. Unlike many of the kings before him, Hezekiah was all about faithfulness to God. He tore down idol worship sites and called the nation back to spiritual renewal. Bold move, right? But Judah was still living under a dark shadow, Assyria. After all, this was the same empire that had already wiped out the northern kingdom of Israel not too long ago. Then came Sennacherib. The Assyrian king set his sights on Jerusalem after bulldozing through several of Judah's fortified cities. For the people of Jerusalem, it was a waking nightmare. They were surrounded by what felt like an unstoppable war machine, with no resources to put up much of a fight. It looked hopeless, but what really set things off wasn't just Assyria's military might. It was Sennacherib's arrogance. He didn't stop at mocking Hezekiah and his people. Nope, he went straight for the jugular, challenging God himself. Sennacherib sent messengers with a message dripping with disdain. No god from any nation had ever been able to stop Assyria. And, in his mind, the God of Judah wouldn't be any different. It was a direct slap in the face to God's sovereignty. Can you imagine the tension, the fear, and the questions swirling around in people's minds? Why would God let Judah get backed into such a desperate corner? Was this a test of faith? Or was God setting the stage for something bigger? What looked like the end for Judah was about to turn into one of the most jaw-dropping moments in biblical history. Stay tuned. The answer to what happened on that fateful night is laid out in 3 key passages: 2 Kings 19:35, Isaiah 37:36, and 2 Chronicles 32:21. These verses, though brief, tell one of the most jaw-dropping stories in the Bible: the overnight destruction of the Assyrian army. According to 2 Kings 19:35, it was the angel of the Lord who struck down 185,000 soldiers in the Assyrian camp. By morning, when the people of Jerusalem peeked over the walls, the sight was chilling. Bodies scattered everywhere. The seemingly unstoppable army from the night before, gone, silent, just like that. Isaiah 37:36 backs this up, making it clear that this was no ordinary event. It was divine intervention, God answering King Hezekiah's desperate prayer. Then there's 2 Chronicles 32:21, which adds another layer to the story. Not only did the angel wipe out the troops, but Sennacherib, the mighty Assyrian king, was forced to return to Nineveh in disgrace, only to be assassinated by his own son. Talk about an unexpected twist. But here's the thing. While these passages describe what happened, they don't outright tell us why God acted the way he did. That's where we need to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. One thing's for sure, this wasn't some random stroke of luck or a freak accident. The Bible is clear. This was a deliberate act of God. But why? Was it just about saving Jerusalem? Or was there something deeper going on? And that's the question that pulls us in, isn't it? To truly grasp what happened that night, we need to dig into the spiritual context. Because this event wasn't just about victory in battle. It reveals something profound about God's character and his purposes. Let's unpack that. To really get why God allowed the destruction of 185,000 Assyrian soldiers, we've got to step back and look beyond just the event itself. This wasn't just a military showdown, It was a battle for God's honor and sovereignty in the face of a direct insult. The stakes were way higher than what met the eye. Judah's spiritual track record up to that point? Pretty shaky. Many of the kings before Hezekiah had led the people into idol worship, turning to foreign gods and ignoring God's command. That disobedience had serious consequences, including the fall of the northern kingdom to Assyria. But Hezekiah? He was cut from a different cloth. He led a spiritual revival, restoring true worship and bringing reforms to align Judah with God's will. But even with all those efforts, Hezekiah found himself facing a huge challenge: the arrogance of King Sennacherib. Now, Sennacherib wasn't just your average ruler. He saw himself as unstoppable, a conqueror who thought no power, human or divine, could get in his way. His threats to Hezekiah were more than just military warnings. They were outright blasphemy. He mocked the God of Israel, lumping him in with the powerless gods of other nations Assyria had already crushed. To Sennacherib, the god of Hezekiah was just another made-up deity, incapable of doing anything to stop him. This was a direct challenge to one of the core truths about God. His holiness and sovereignty aren't up for debate. Remember Exodus 23? "You shall have no other gods before me." God doesn't share his glory, not with anyone or anything. When Sennacherib insulted the God of Israel, he wasn't just challenging Judah, he was going toe-to-toe with the creator of the universe. And here's where things get even more interesting. This event also highlights something deep about God's character. He's both just and merciful. He protects his people, but doesn't shy away from bringing judgment on those who defy him. The destruction of the Assyrian army wasn't some random act. It was God's direct response to Hezekiah's heartfelt prayer. In Isaiah 37:16-20, Hezekiah prayed, "Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, enthroned between the cherubim, you alone are God over all the kingdoms of the earth." It was a bold prayer, a confession of total dependence on God. Hezekiah knew that only God could save Jerusalem, and he put everything in God's hands. And wow, did God deliver. The Assyrian army, invincible by human standards, was wiped out in a single night. It was a clear reminder that no human power, no matter how great, can stand against God's will. But here's the thing. Why did God choose to send an angel instead of using human means to defeat the Assyrians? That choice wasn't random. It carried deep theological significance. To really understand it, we need to unpack the role of the angel of the Lord in this story. Let's dive into that next. The story of 185,000 Assyrian soldiers wiped out in a single night credits the act to the angel of the Lord. But who or what is the angel of the Lord? This title pops up throughout Scripture, always tied to moments of incredible power, whether it's about protection or judgment. To really grasp the significance of what happened that night, we need to understand this figure's role. First off, the angel of the Lord isn't just your average messenger. In several passages, this figure acts as a direct representation of God himself, speaking and acting with divine authority. Take the burning bush in Exodus 3, for example. It's the angel of the Lord who appears to Moses, but the text quickly makes it clear that Moses is hearing from God directly. So, it's not a stretch to see the angel of the Lord as a theophany, a visible manifestation of God. Now, in the case of the Assyrian army's destruction, the angel of the Lord wasn't just an observer. This was God stepping into human history in a big way. No human armies, no brilliant strategies, no weapons, just one night and one divine being to deliver a judgment that altered the course of events. It's a dramatic reminder of two things: God's absolute sovereignty and his supernatural power to protect his people and defend his honor. But why did God choose to send the angel of the Lord instead of using human means? The answer lies in what he wanted to communicate. This wasn't about Judah's strength or Hezekiah's leadership. It was about showing, without a doubt, that the victory came from God alone. Remember Hezekiah's words to his people in 2 Chronicles 32:7-8? "With him is an arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battle." By sending the angel of the Lord, God made it clear this wasn't a human achievement. It was divine intervention. The angel of the Lord's role also speaks volumes about God's justice and mercy. Judah was backed into a corner, helpless and hopeless. But in response to Hezekiah's prayer and faith, God acted. On the flip side, Assyria, the embodiment of pride, oppression, and idolatry, was met with a swift and decisive judgment. This wasn't just about delivering Judah. It was a statement to the watching world, both Jerusalem and the surrounding nations, about who God is, holy, sovereign, and unstoppable. So, what do we take away from all this? The angel of the Lord wasn't just a judge, he was also a messenger, revealing the character of God. And that raises bigger questions. Why did God choose such an extreme act? What does this teach us about his plan for his people and the nations around them? To dig into those questions, we need to wrestle with the concept of divine justice and how it played out in this context. Let's break it down. The destruction of 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in a single night forces us to wrestle with a tough question. Why would God allow something so massive, so final? For many, it might seem harsh, even over the top. But here's the thing. The Bible's view of God's justice is way deeper and broader than our human sense of right and wrong. To get it, we've got to unpack a few key ideas. First off, God's justice is directly tied to his holiness. The Bible describes God as perfectly holy, meaning he can't tolerate sin or rebellion. The Assyrians, led by Sennacherib, weren't just another invading army. They represented a culture steeped in idolatry, violence, and arrogance. Their military campaigns weren't just about grabbing land. They were a direct challenge to God's sovereignty. And Sennacherib, he took things a step further. His blasphemous claims made it clear he didn't see Israel's God as any different from the powerless gods of the other nations Assyria had steamrolled. That kind of arrogance put Sennacherib and his army in direct opposition to God, who doesn't just defend his people, he defends his glory. This event also drives home a big point. God is sovereign over all nations. In Isaiah 46:9-10, God says, "I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me. I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times, what is still to come." That's not just a statement, it's a reality check. God has both the right and the power to step into human history and carry out his plan, including holding rebellious nations accountable. At the same time, we can't ignore God's mercy in the midst of his justice. This wasn't some sudden, unprovoked act of judgment. Time and again, through the prophet, God warned nations, including Assyria, Israel, and Judah, about the consequences of their action. But when those warnings went unheeded, judgment followed. Even so, this wasn't just about punishing Assyria. It was also about protecting his people. Judah was in a desperate spot, completely outmatched and defenseless. Without God's intervention, they'd have been wiped out. His response wasn't just judgment. It was an act of faithfulness to his promises and an answer to Hezekiah's prayers. Now, let's not miss the bigger picture. This story pushes us to think about who God really is. Is he just a God of love and mercy? Or is he also just and holy? According to the Bible, he's both. His justice is never divorced from his goodness, and his goodness never ignores the need for justice. But what does this ancient story mean for us today? What can we take away from it about God's character and how he works in our lives? And how did this event shape the faith of the people of Judah and the nations watching from the sideline? Before diving into those questions, let's reflect on the ripple effects of this moment, both then and now. The impact of the Assyrian army's destruction was massive for the people of Judah and for the nations watching from the sideline. For the folks in Jerusalem, it was nothing short of life-changing. Imagine being surrounded by an army that seemed unbeatable, listening to their threats day after day, and then waking up to find them completely wiped out, without a single battle fought. That kind of experience doesn't just fade away. It drove home a powerful truth. God is the ultimate protector of his people, and he can do the impossible. For the people reading this story later, especially those living through tough times of crisis or persecution, it became a source of hope. It reminded them that God isn't limited by human odds or circumstances. When things seem hopeless, he has the power to step in and turn everything around. It's a reminder that victory doesn't come from human strength or strategy, it comes from God's faithfulness. And the ripple effects didn't stop there. The neighboring nations? Oh, you can bet they took notice. News of the world's most powerful army being wiped out in one night had to spread like wildfire. It wasn't just about defending Jerusalem, it was a global statement. The God of Israel wasn't like the so-called gods of other nations. He's the real deal, sovereign over all, unmatched by any other power. But there's another side to this story, a warning about pride. Sennacherib thought he was untouchable. He was sure no one, human or divine, could stand in his way. He trusted in his army, his conquests, and his reputation. And yet, his downfall showed just how fragile human arrogance really is when it comes face to face with God's power. It's a universal lesson. Pride and self-exaltation eventually lead to collapse. For God's people, though, this wasn't just a story about judgment. It was also a powerful reminder that God answers sincere prayers. Hezekiah didn't try to take on the Assyrians with military strategies or alliances. Instead, he laid the problem before God, humbly and honestly. His faith and dependence are a model for anyone facing overwhelming situations. And God, he didn't just listen. He responded in a way that nobody could have seen coming. Of course, this raises big questions about how we understand divine justice. For some, the idea of God wiping out an entire army feels harsh, even unsettling. But this story shows that God's judgment is always rooted in His holiness. He doesn't act out of vengeance or randomness. He acts with purpose to accomplish His will and reveal His glory. Above all, the core takeaway is this: God never abandons those who trust in Him. Even when things seem completely lost, He's capable of moving in ways that defy human understanding. That's the kind of confidence that has sustained His people through every generation. So, looking at this event and all its ripple effects, the question naturally follows: what does this teach us about the challenges and crises we face today? Let's dive into that next. The destruction of the Assyrian army in a single night isn't just an ancient story locked in the past. It's a powerful narrative that still speaks to the challenges we face today. Sure, we're not surrounded by physical armies like Jerusalem was, but let's be real. Life has its share of overwhelming moments, times when we feel cornered, outmatched, and powerless against forces way bigger than us. This story offers timeless lessons we can lean on in our own struggle. First off, it's all about trust. Hezekiah didn't scramble to muster his army or rely on some last-minute alliance. Instead, he brought his fears straight to God in prayer. That's huge. When life feels chaotic, it's so easy to fall into panic mode or try to handle everything ourselves. But Hezekiah's experience reminds us that true victory comes when we acknowledge our dependence on God and seek His guidance. It's not about what we can do. It's about what He can do. And let's talk about pride for a second. Sennacherib thought he was untouchable. His power, his army, his track record, they were everything to him. Sound familiar? In a world that glorifies self-reliance, power, and wealth, his story hits home. It's a reality check that all those things are temporary, no matter how solid they seem. God's power makes even the strongest human efforts look fragile. That challenges us to stay grounded, live humbly, and remember that everything we have comes from Him. Another big takeaway is God's sovereignty. From a human perspective, it looked like the Assyrians were running the show. But behind the scenes, God was in control, orchestrating events for His purposes. That's a game changer for how we view our struggle. Even when life feels uncertain or chaotic, God isn't caught off guard. He's always working, often in ways we can't see, for the good of those who trust Him. That's a promise we can cling to. And then there's this: God's ways don't always make sense to us. Who would have guessed an unstoppable army could be wiped out without a single fight? It's a reminder not to box God into our expectations. He operates on a whole different level, one that often defies human logic. So, when things seem impossible, we need to leave room for the miraculous. He can and does work in ways we'd never imagine. Finally, this story calls us to think about how we respond when God steps in. The people of Jerusalem witnessed something extraordinary, and so do we in our own lives. When God intervenes, it's not just about solving our problem. It's an opportunity to share His faithfulness with others. How we respond to His work in our lives can inspire those around us to trust Him too. At its core, this story isn't just history. It's a living reminder of who God is: faithful, powerful, and always in control. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And His promises, they're still rock solid. So here's the real question: how can we live in a way that reflects our trust in this sovereign God? Let's wrap up by digging into how that perspective can reshape the way we see life. The destruction of the Assyrian army in a single night wasn't just a historical event or an act of judgment. It was a powerful display of who God is: sovereign, holy, just, and merciful. He didn't just protect Jerusalem. He left a legacy of lessons that still inspire and challenge us today. This story is a clear reminder that God is faithful to those who trust in Him, even when the odds seem impossible. For Hezekiah and the people of Judah, the situation must have felt like the end. They were surrounded by a relentless enemy, with no resources and nowhere to turn. It would have been easy to give in to fear or despair. But Hezekiah made a decision that changed everything. He chose to trust God. That choice was a game changer, not because God needed Hezekiah's permission to act, but because the king's faith was a powerful testament to his surrender to God's sovereignty. And let's be real, that's not always an easy move, but Hezekiah's trust serves as a model for us. Life throws all kinds of armies our way: financial struggles, family conflicts, health crises, or even spiritual doubt. In those moments, this story reminds us we're not alone. The same God who answered Hezekiah's prayer is still listening and responding today. But here's the thing: this story also challenges how we think about God's power. A lot of times, we expect Him to act in ways that make sense to us, a logical solution, a clear plan. Yet, God often works in ways that completely defy our understanding. He moves through the unexpected, the supernatural, and sometimes even the silent. That pushes us to let go of our limited expectation and trust that He's in control, even when the path forward is unclear. Then there's the issue of pride and humility. Sennacherib was the poster child for human arrogance. He believed his military might, and track record made him untouchable, even by God. His downfall is a stark reminder that pride always leads to a fall, while humility and dependence on God lead to reward. For us, it's a call to live with a constant awareness that everything we have, our talents, opportunity, and resources, comes from God and is meant for His glory. Finally, this story invites us to be witnesses of God's power in our own lives. Just like the people of Jerusalem saw firsthand what God could do, we're called to share how He's worked in our lives, not just for our own encouragement, but to inspire others to trust Him too. The destruction of the Assyrian army wasn't the end of Judah's story. It was a fresh start, a moment of renewed faith and recognition of God's greatness. And for us today, it's still a reminder that the God who acted back then is the same God who's at work in our lives now. He's faithful, powerful, and absolutely worthy of our trust. So, what about you? What lessons from this story hit home for you? How have you trusted God in your own tough time? Drop a comment and share your story. We'd love to hear it. And if this message spoke to you, don't forget to like and share it so more people can discover the power and faithfulness of God. Stay tuned for more reflections and story, and we'll see you next time.